Hello and welcome back to Introduction to Intellectual Property. Today's lecture is on patentable subject matter and patent policy. The agenda for this lecture is to first have an overview of subject matter limitations, the restrictions on what you can and can't patent. And these are slightly different, as we're going to find out, than the patentability requirements we've talked about throughout most of the course so far. And then we're going to talk about the two specific primary areas in which patentable subject matter restrictions apply. And that is one, patenting life forms, and then the second, patenting algorithms such as computer software or business models. So let's dive in. So an overview of subject matter limits is to start with our standards of patentability. And we've looked at this list before, and in order to have a valid patent, you need to meet all of these particular standards. It needs to be fully and appropriately described. It has to be in compliance with the statutory bars from Section 102, the novelty requirement of Section 102, Section 103 non-obviousness. It has to be the work of the inventors, has to be useful. Neither of those two we're going to cover in this course, but I wanted to flag them for you. And then finally, what we're going to talk about now has to be every patent that's a valid patent has to be within the appropriate subject matter, and that's found in Section 101. Section 101 is a relatively straightforward section of the patent law and simply says whoever invents or discovers any new and useful process, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter, or any new and useful improvement thereof may obtain a patent subject to the conditions and requirements for this title. Note that the structure of Section 101 is that it is the first part of the patent statute. This is the very first provision that's meaningful in terms of what can be patented and what can't. And it says that all of these things are patentable subject to the other requirements of the patent statute. What that means is that Section 101 is effectively a gateway or a hurdle, the first hurdle that you need to overcome in order to have a patentable invention. The other thing to note from Section 101 is that there are really two separate requirements. The first one, and the one we won't really cover in this course, is the one that's indicated in the word useful, a new and useful process and so forth. And that's the utility requirement. There is a requirement in the patent law that all inventions be useful. That requirement is not a particularly stringent requirement. Basically, the patentee has to assert some real-world use for his or her invention in order to get a patent. There's not a lot of testing, no confirmation of that by the Patent Office. You can't make an implausible claim of utility, such as for a perpetual motion machine or something that defies basic elements of physics. But other than that, you can really claim any use you want for your invention and overcome the utility requirement. The more important and the more stringent requirement, and the one we're going to talk about in this lecture, is found in the words process, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter. Taken together, this list of words comprises the subject matter requirement. This is the list of subject matters for which patents are allowed. Over time, over about 150 years, the Supreme Court in particular has developed a set of categories of subject matter limitations based on this language. So what it has done is taken the language of Section 101 and its precursor sections over the years and divided that really into three different limitations on what can't be patented. And the first are laws of nature. So for example, you can't patent the concept of gravity or the concept of relativity. Basic physical laws that occur naturally are not patentable. We're really not going to talk about that very much in this course because those very rarely come up. What comes up more often are the categories of natural phenomena, which is typically found in living organisms, whether those are patentable or not, and then naturally occurring products. And the cases we'll be looking at there relate to primarily DNA patents, genetic material, and so forth. And the third category of subject matter limitations, the third area in which you can't get a patent, is known as the abstract ideas category. And that is classically mathematical algorithms. So you can't patent mathematical algorithms, you can't patent math. The question there in that category is how far do these mathematical algorithm exceptions to the patent statute go? Can computer software, for example, be patented? Because really what computer software is just an algorithmic set of instructions, often using math for a general purpose computer. Similarly, business models, which have undergone a lot of patenting in recent decades, is another area in which abstract ideas exception comes to bear, as we'll find out when we talk about that in more detail. So the other thing I want to flag for you right at the outset is that if you read the terms of the Section 101 statute, in particular the list of categories in which you are allowed to patent, a process, a machine, a manufacture, or a composition of matter, that is an extraordinarily broad set of categories in which you can patent. And indeed, when Congress passed this particular statute in 1952, the legislative history that went into it at the time was similarly broad. In fact, Congress, when it was describing the scope of Section 101, suggested that it wanted anything under the sun made by man to be patentable. What this means is there isn't clear support in the statutory language itself for the limits on subject matter that we just covered, those three categories of limitation. Instead, this is a judicially created set of exceptions, almost entirely, actually entirely, the creature of the courts over decades of refinement. And so this is a policy lever, but it's a policy lever that's been developed entirely by the courts. And this is somewhat unique, even in the annals of American legal systems. Typically, we think of policy choices as something that's done by Congress primarily, or sometimes the executive branch through the president and the agencies. This particular part of the patent law is a clear and unambiguous area where the courts, in particular the Supreme Court, has decided that what it's going to do is exert its authority to engage in policymaking, a balancing between various competing interests surrounding a set of policies, and weigh in on that in a way that looks very much like legislative action or administrative rulemaking. That is interesting and because not only is this an area where there's not a lot of clear statutory justification for it, but the other standards for validity, the ones that do have textual support in the statute, typically operate on an invention by invention basis. So if I have a patent for a new Frisbee, for example, that's going to be tested as to whether it's novel on the basis of that invention itself. I'm going to ask the question, is it new? Is it non-obvious? Have I fully described it? And the answers will depend on the individual invention that I've made, whether my Frisbee is good enough, whether it's new enough, non-obvious enough, and whether I've described it fully. The subject matter limitations we're going to talk about in this lecture are a different animal entirely in that they operate at the level of entire categories of technology. So it'd be as if instead of asking whether my Frisbee invention is novel, whether it's non-obvious or fully described, we are asking the question in the subject matter context as to whether or not this entire category of Frisbees should be allowed at all in terms of patentability. Now note that in terms of patentability, that's all we're talking about. It doesn't mean that I can't invent in these areas, even these areas that are not covered or not allowed under the subject matter restrictions. It just means that there's no patents available for them, and the incentive effects of the patent system are not available. And so this is an interesting policy lever because, one, it's made by courts entirely. It's really nothing that Congress has ever weighed in on. And second, it's a categorical set of criteria, not individual invention by invention. And so by design, the way the courts have set these categories and these restrictions up are to be very flexible and adaptable. And you can understand why. Technology changes literally every day. And so any rules, any policies, any attempts to sort of carve out what is and isn't allowed is going to be very difficult to make stick as technologies change. And for that reason, this is probably the area of patent law where the courts, in particular the Supreme Court, has struggled more than any other to develop clear, concise, consistent rules. And part of that is just the very nature of the way these rules work, is that they are supposed to be flexible, they're supposed to be adaptable. Flexible and adaptable can also, in many cases, mean unclear and uncertain and subject to lots of controversy, and the subject matter requirements are certainly no exception to that.